a series of cities around Europe and of course the world are becoming real cities under pressure because they're attracting people. I would call these vortex cities: Berlin, Amsterdam, soon Athens, of course Lisbon, and Paris and London. And these attract people because of opportunity, resources, and so on. And what you then get is a combination of both the positive and the potentially negative. The positive is that you get fresh ideas, you get stimulation and so on. But you might also then get too many tourists, for example. You might get pressures of gentrification, all of these things. So you can feel them in Berlin. And the key point about the Civic City and the Nomadic World book I'm talking about is to ask the question, where do I belong when everything is on the move? Or where do we belong when everything is on the move? Well, the problem about Berlin is, yes, there is of course creativity, there are lots of interesting people and so on, and obviously its history led to a certain sort of mürrishness, you know, people want to do things differently and so on. But not every aspect of Berlin is creative, and I wrote a book called The Creative Bureaucracy, and we had a festival in Berlin last year on that. So the question is the whole ecosystem creative and imaginative? Because if only one part is, and there's lots of blockages, then the system as a whole isn't like that. So a warning, perhaps. Well, of course, in a world which is facing the fourth industrial revolution that you hope is clean, green, lean, and all of that. So of course it has a central role because it's completely redefining place, space, and time. And that links back to the nomadic world thing, that you can work anywhere, anytime, and so on. And so its role is, of course, fundamental because it's a driver of the economy, but it is also the enabler to allow that world to be nomadic. Well, what I try to do in that book is bring lots of things together. So I've done a lot of work, or I've written books about the digitized city. What does that look and feel like? About the psychology of cities. What is it emotionally like? What is the experience of place emotionally? And I've also looked at ambition, how you generate ambition in cities. So in a funny way, it does summarize everything. It sort of tries to encapsulate it all in one. But the first sentence of the book is, unfortunately, the world is turning to its darker face. Apprehension is in the air. Our social and our tribal selves are beginning to be in conflict. And the question is, when we feel relaxed about place and developments, our social selves comes more out. But when we feel overwhelmed by change, for example, digital change and so on, we become more inward-looking and tribal. And that, I think, is one of the central issues we all have to face, so that question of absorbing diversity, trying to see the diversity dividend is a major factor. That is an interesting question. I would try to generate a culture which says we are moving from a no because culture to a yes if culture. And that is incredibly easy to say and difficult to do. But what that's really saying is we don't need to change everything, but let's just be positive about its potential. Let's look at it closely and not automatically close ourselves in. So that cultural change, which would imply obviously the public administration, but also the other sectors, the corporate and the civic sectors, and certainly also the university sector. So that change in spirit, that change in mindset, that change in culture is what I would love to change. Easily said, difficult to do. The problem I'm just raising there is everywhere, but it's stronger in some places than in others. Obviously, you know, when you talk about creativity, and you know, I wrote a book about the creative city, and the simple summary of that whole project is really how do you generate the conditions where people can think, plan, and act with imagination. Now, that doesn't mean, in trying to, of course, solve problems and create opportunities, that doesn't mean that everything has to be new. But the creative element of it, and this is a problem everywhere, is the willingness to stand back and look at things afresh. Sometimes the creative thing is to leave things exactly as they were, but at least you've looked at it afresh.